Welcome back, leaders, to Empowering You, a strengths-based podcast for leaders of leaders. I'm your host, Dr. Shauna T. Sobers. We're talking about something many leaders experience, but rarely name: the freeze trauma response. But we're going to talk about it at work specifically. But before we get into that, I want to share a quote from my book, The Resilience Tree, page 32, if you wanted to follow along. That's in chapter 5, talking about fruit. And here's our quote. All too often, people do not know the impact they are having on the lives of others because we do not actively tell them. I love this reminder because our actions and sometimes even our pauses have impact. Sometimes the most responsible thing we can do as leaders is recognize when we don't have it to give in that particular moment. When we push ourselves to produce anyway, it can harm us, it can strain our relationships, and ultimately, it can fail to nourish the very people that we're trying to serve. I envision this. Your tree gives fruit. The fruit may be getting smaller and smaller. Someone takes a bite into that fruit and it's bitter, it's sour, it's not nourishing. That's not what we want. That brings us to today's conversation, because sometimes what looks like hesitation or silence is actually something deeper happening in our nervous system. When the freeze trauma response shows up. So I'm going to tell a story. I once had a supervisor text me a message. We need to talk. Dun, dun, dun. I know, immediately my body froze. I couldn't focus on the task in front of me. I reread that text over and over. My chest felt tight. My thoughts went blank. I was spiraling. For the rest of the day, I was paralyzed, unable to produce anything meaningful until the meeting finally happening. And then the meeting, it was a simple check-in. But my nervous system didn't know that. It didn't know the difference between a check-in meeting and something major going to happen. What my body remembered was a previous job, a previous supervisor, where the words, "we need to talk," led to being blindsided in a performance review full of unexpected criticism. And I know me as a supervisor, when I go into an evaluation, I really try to make sure that nothing is new or surprising. But not every supervisor does that. So even though my current supervisor simply wanted my input on how I was contributing to the team, my nervous system was reacting to something from the past. It was a trigger. My body was trying to protect me. But in doing so, it also shut me down. I want to make sure that we talk about topics like this so that you all know that you're not alone. If you've ever had a moment like this at work, I want you to pause. Take a breath. Know that I've been there. I'm not immune. And if you needed to hear this today, I'm grateful that you're here. And because I want you to know that you're not alone. And certainly if you know someone who needs to hear this, send this to them now. So what are other ways that freeze response can look at work? So it isn't about indecisiveness or even lack of preparation. It's when the body takes over because of a trigger. In professional spaces, it may look like feeling paralyzed when you're asked a question on the spot, or losing your words even though you know the answer, sitting silently in a meeting even though you have ideas that you want to contribute, being unable to focus while anticipating a difficult conversation. Leaders, just as well as those who report to them, experience this too. So for a manager or a supervisor, it may be avoiding difficult conversations, delaying decisions, maybe doing that over-analyzing of the options, or you too being unusually quiet in meetings, not because you don't care, but because maybe your nervous system is trying to protect you from a perceived threat. And that's the thing about trauma responses, is that it's your body's way of protecting you from that threat. It's a survival mechanism. So there's an important distinction before we go any further. Many of the behaviors that I may be describing, so like pausing before responding or thinking through things or choosing not to speak immediately, can be healthy leadership practices, thoughtfulness, reflection, and internal silence, or often signs of wisdom. So when we talk about the freeze trauma response, we're not talking about those intentional choices. We're talking about when your body takes over, your thoughts may go blank, or your chest might tighten, or you know what you're going to say, and then the words just don't come. And this is maybe happening because of the triggers that are happening in that present moment, and your brain trying to protect you based on what it remembers, even if the current situation is actually pretty safe. So instead of immediately labeling the behavior, ask yourself, was I intentionally pausing, or did my body feel stuck because something reminded me of the past? That awareness alone can be incredibly powerful. So let's go into a little bit of how the brain works, just for funsies, right? So neuroscience tells us that when the brain perceives threat, the amygdala, or your brain's alarm system, can hijack the prefrontal cortex. Or the prefrontal cortex is responsible for that higher order thinking. So that planning, that reasoning, that decision making, that problem solving, and emotional regulation. So when that alarm system takes over and the brain shifts into survival mode, that's when your freeze can happen. Okay, so why are we even talking about any of this? What does that have to do with leadership? You may wonder. Gallup's research talks about the 4 needs of the followers, if you may remember. It's hope, trust, compassion, and stability. So if your body goes into a freeze response, it can maybe chip away at one of those needs of the follower, trust. Not because of lack of care or lack of competence, but because others might misinterpret that silence or that hesitation, especially if it's not your normal behavior. So a team member may think, why isn't my manager responding? Why don't they say anything? They don't really care. But in reality, it may be their nervous system may be in there trying to protect them, in their protective mode. And then this is where it's helpful to have tools like the resilience tree to be able to maybe come back into your body. So living the resilience tree. So when your body protects you from those perceived trauma with that freeze response, we can use the resilience tree model to help move from survival mode back into leadership presence. So remember the components of the resilience tree: roots, branches, fruit, and environment. Roots are about rest and refuel. Branches are going to be about reconnecting with other people. Our fruit is going to be our output, and the environment is the context and the system and cultures around you. So roots, with being rest and refuel, you're going to pause, you're going to breathe, and you're going to reconnect with who you are. You're going to spend time in spaces or communities that reflect your identity, your passions, your values. Those roots are going to help you feel safe, feel seen, and feel energized. So now branches are those support systems. If this starts happening to you, Branches are going to be those people who believe in you. So go find the people who believe in you, the people who open doors for you, who support you, who challenge you in the best ways possible. So those are going to be your trusted mentors, colleagues, or peers that can help provide that perspective that when the freeze response clouds your ability to see options clearly, they can remind you and reassure you that pausing doesn't mean failing, that one moment doesn't define you as a leader. If we're thinking about the environment next, so those systems and cultures that are surrounding you, and this freeze happens. So if you know this has happened for you, you reduce the likelihood of it happening for others that you may lead by communicating with clarity and safety. So for example, instead of saying, we need to talk, like my supervisor did, you could say things like, when we get a moment, I'd like to hear your perspective on how that project went. So that the culture that you're creating as a leader creates a safer environment for someone not potentially to get triggered. Or maybe if you're aware of those things, you can ask the question, hey, I've noticed that you are acting differently than what I'm normally used to. Can you tell me what's going on there? Then when you get that feedback, you can adjust accordingly. So creating those cultures that allow for people to be vulnerable and to share what they're going through and to share what they need from you as a supervisor is going to be really helpful. We're making it safe for leaders to move through that freeze response without fear of judgment or negative ramifications. And then fruit is where we have boundaries or pause, or where we might give back. And so sometimes that freeze response in this sense can be an invitation to create more space. So we can say, I need a moment to gather my thoughts, or can we circle back later? So if you recognize and can feel your body go into that freeze, one way to cope with it in the fruit category is to ask for more time to allow yourself to reset your nervous system. Maybe go for a walk, go to the bathroom, go drink some water. And then you can come back to yourself and your thoughts and be able to move from there. And all of this, all of these things that you can do to manage is still leadership. Leadership doesn't mean that you're perfect and nothing ever happens. And so definitely want you all to know that things like this happen all the time to both leaders and followers. And these are some ways that we can get around it. So if you keep remembering the components of the tree, then hopefully that helps. The next time you notice yourself demonstrating freeze-like behaviors that you think might be a trauma response, ask yourself, is this about the present moment and what's happening right now? Or is it my body remembering the past and responding to something that might not be what's happening right now? And then you can ask yourself, which of the resilience tree components, roots, branches, fruit, environment, can support me and can allow me to come back to my present self? So how can you live the resilience tree in this moment to rebuild trust? Remembering having a freeze response is not weakness. It's a signal. And when we learn to lean in and listen to those signals that our body is telling us, because the body keeps score, we can respond with clarity and compassion and resilience. Thank you so much for tuning in to Empowering You, a strengths-based podcast for leaders of leaders. I'm your host, Dr. Shauna T. Sobers, and I really hope this episode inspired and equipped you to step boldly into your leadership journey. And again, if today's episode added value for you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with a friend, a coworker, family member who may need to hear it. Subscribe so you can be notified when the next episode comes out. Add a comment. I'd love to hear how you've been navigating this. And at any time, visit ShaunaTSobers.com to book me to speak at your next event or team retreat, or to order a signed copy of the Resilience Tree book, download worksheets, things like that. Because it's only together that we're going to build this community of empowered leaders lifting each other up. Until next time, remember to lead with strengths, live with purpose, and always empower you.